Jenny Odell is an Oakland-based multidisciplinary artist and writer. Her writing has appeared in New York Times, New York Magazine, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and the Paris Review. Her visual work has been exhibited in the United States at the Contemporary Jewish Museum and the New York Public Library, as well as internationally in France, China, and Dubai. Odell has been an artist in residence at Facebook, the Internet Archive, the San Francisco Planning Department, and Recology SF. She is a lecturer in the Department of Art and Art History at Stanford University. Jenny, thank you so much for being with us at the library this evening. Thank you for being here an hour earlier than planned.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to meet you, and it was such a pleasure to read your book this weekend and to reread it today in anticipation for our conversation. I guess my first question is, could you describe to the audience kind of your inspiration for the book? So kind of where it came out of.
Yeah, sure. So it was a pretty unusual trajectory, I would say, or it's unexpected for me. So essentially after the 2016 election, you know, have to kind of put yourself back in that headspace. You know, I think a lot of people I knew were feeling very, not just heartbroken, but kind of paralyzed. And for me in Oakland, that was really augmented by the Ghost Ship fire, which was the catastrophic warehouse fire that happened here that a lot of artists passed away in. So that happened around the same time. And it was just this kind of pall that was hanging over everything. And so I found myself going quite often to this rose garden, which is my virtual background, about 5 minutes from my apartment in Oakland, and just sitting there, quote unquote, doing nothing. That's just I mean, I feel like everyone I knew had some reaction like that, because I know a lot of artists and writers, and there was this kind of overarching question of what does my work mean, or what do I do right now? So I was going and sitting there. And then around that time, I was asked to give a talk the following summer, and I was given a blank slate. So it could just, you know, be whatever I wanted. And at that time, I really didn't know what to say other than just to observe what was going on with me. So I submitted the talk title, How to Do Nothing, without necessarily having a talk yet. And then I just kind of spent the next, you know, 4 or 5 months thinking about why was I going and sitting there? What is different about this space than the other spaces I find myself in? And ultimately the necessity of like reflection and maintenance, because the Rose Garden is largely staffed by volunteers. And so you just go there and you see this kind of image of maintenance all year, right? If you are a gardener, you know that roses really require quite a bit of work. So yeah, that's kind of where it came out of. And I ended up giving this talk called How to Do Nothing the following summer that turned into chapter 1 of this book. And I also have to say that it wouldn't have become a book without the suggestion of another author who was at that event, and Adam Greenfield. And he basically said, you know, you should consider turning this into a book. And my background at the time was more in art than writing. So that's not something that would have occurred to me. So I really have to give him a lot of credit for that.
Yeah, I had heard in the interview that you said that the kind of response for that talk was, there was a big response, as in people were it really kind of struck a nerve.
Yeah, and the reason that was surprising to me was that I wrote that talk for a conference that was mostly art and technology. So the type of person there, I mean, it's a pretty narrow audience. Although people there also work in a very sort of interdisciplinary way. So I wouldn't call it like a tech conference, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. But there was an audience of people who make things for their job. And that's what my job was at the time. And so I was already pleasantly surprised that it resonated with the audience that I wrote it for. I was really surprised, you know, I put it on Medium, that like many people outside of that context, and also like people of all different ages, like people who didn't grow up with social media or people who did grow up with social media, were relating to it. And the thing that I heard the most often was just like, and I still hear this, is like, there's something that I've been feeling for years, and you just put words to a feeling. That's like the reaction that happened with that talk, and then also with the book.
So yeah, let's talk about the feeling, and let's talk the feeling that you've articulated in the book, because it's called How to Do Nothing, which in some sense it's not really true. I mean, as soon as you start reading it, you kind of realize, oh, this maybe is more about, there's more going on here than just kind of doing nothing. And you describe the book in variety of interviews. You say it's not really an activist book, it's not really a self-help book. In the introduction, you say you invite the reader to kind of take a walk with you. You describe it as kind of a journey, as an extended essay. I mean, it's incredibly interdisciplinary. You mention everyone from Socrates to Audre Lorde to Emily Dickinson. I mean, it's just kind of like a panoply of references. How did you kind of conceive of this expansive notion of how to do nothing in kind of a book form?
I think it was pretty organic, really. The thing that I now appreciate actually about other books a lot more after having written that one, those are references that I've been essentially collecting for my entire life. You know, it's like, it's very different because I'm writing my second book right now, and it's, you know, I feel like I, you know, don't have as much material because like, these are just, I think how to do nothing is just like one version of a question that I have had for a really, really long time, like for my entire adult life, about just how we value time and what work means. And so I'd had these sort of like growing piles of things that I often referred back to just for my own sort of thinking about things. And I keep journals. I mean, I've had journals since I was very little, and I have all of them. So I have the proof. I can go back and see that, you know, actually even before I had an iPhone, because I got an iPhone relatively late, I'm already saying many of the things that are in How to Do Nothing, almost verbatim. So it's like a lot of these things were kind of a long time coming, or, you know, there's references in the book that were things I read in high school. So, you know, if I did anything, it was like, I happened to keep really good track of things that I read that I think are useful. I am very diligent about keeping notes and keeping them all in the same place. But it was really, I mean, this is a bit of an odd comparison, but I read a lot about dreams because I have really crazy dreams every night. And there was this one book about the sort of science of dreaming where he says that it's almost like in some dreams there's some overarching sort of message or image or idea, and then your brain just kind of uses the material that's at its disposal to make that point or to be the characters, right? And that's kind of how the book felt. It's like, I think even if I had encountered, you know, other references, like not Emily Dickinson and not like Diogenes and not all, they would have just been something else. They would have just been whatever else I had encountered that helps make that point. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. And so the point broadly, well, I would love for you to make the point. It's your point. Is so I guess, can you explain to the audience kind of like, what do you mean by How to Do Nothing? What are you trying to get at by kind of that provocative title? And underneath How to Do Nothing, you know, there are kind of this sense of, it's paradoxical because you're opening up space for actually action, ultimately.
Yeah, I think probably the best way to describe it is one of the examples actually that I give in the book, which is the sound artist Pauline Oliveros, sound artist and composer. She coined this term deep listening, and the practice of deep listening was a collaborative thing where you listen as much as possible to everything you can possibly listen to, inwardly and outwardly. And she says in her sort of justification for why you would need to learn to do this, that everything about our culture prizes judgment, analysis, and sort of a knee-jerk reaction over active listening, openness, like for some amount of time. And it is, especially for someone growing up in that culture, that's like almost like an endurance activity, which I think, you know, she's acknowledging that is something that needs to be relearned. And so in a similar vein, it's like, you know, obviously I mean, what is nothing, right? But I mean, when I use the word nothing in the title, I'm using it the way that it appears from the point of view of like a cut and dried capitalist productivity mindset, where work equals some kind of output that can be measured, you know, divided by units of time. And that also tends to be work that is masculinized, externalized, paid work, you know, so things that's a very narrow sliver of things. Everything around that tends to appear like nothing. And it, you know, has all this baggage of not being valued, or people feeling guilty, you know, taking time to do things that don't fall into that category. I always think about this artist I know who um, every Wednesday she spends the whole day, I don't know if it's the whole day, she spends a good part of her Wednesdays walking around, just going for a walk. And she told me that she ran into a friend on one of these walks, and the friend asked what she was doing, and she said, every Wednesday I go on these walks and I'm not really doing anything. And her friend said, and this is a friend, her friend says, oh wow, you must have a lot of time. Like that reaction is, I think, very telling about how, what we think doing something is. So I mean, that's really the nothing that I'm referring to.
Yeah, you described the book, I love this, you say that it's a full course meal in the age of Soylent.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there's also like a bigger question in the book of like optimizing for what,
Yeah.
or being productive of what, for whom, and why. And it's not cited in the book, but I really love the book Natural Causes by Barbara Ehrenreich for this reason.
Yeah.
It has a really long subtitle, and I can never remember it, but the cover image is the Grim Reaper on a treadmill, and it's basically asking this question of like, how much of your life should you be spending obsessively trying to make it quantitatively longer? Right, or like, and then yeah, and the sort of brute quantitative notion of health, and without asking like healthy for what, or like healthy to do what.
Right. And I had heard an interview that you said you heard the description of the brain melting, and that had kind of changed your perception.
Yeah, I was sitting in the rose garden, and this is actually in the book I'm working on now, that I was sitting there reading Natural Causes, and there's this really graphic description. I mean, I love her because she just doesn't, you could see, especially in that book, people getting so mad at her potentially on like every page, but she just doesn't care. She just plows ahead. And so she has this description of what happens to your brain after you die, and it's really gross. And it's also not what I expected. And yeah, I won't get into it for, but it's gross. And then I looked up, and I just started laughing, because it's like, I was in the garden, and there's all these people, and their kids, and people just having a normal day. And it's like, and then I was just thinking about my own brain, like reading that, and now just looking around, and it's like not always going to be like that. I don't know. It's just really, I feel like she really, in that book, does such an amazing job of, yeah, widening that out into a broader question of like, what does it mean to have a good life? Like being aware of one's mortality, and then also some humility. And surprisingly, in that book, she talks a lot about non-human agency, which is something I really appreciated, and I talk about in my book too.
Yes. We're gonna definitely get to that, because that's the topic that I also find challenging and really important, increasingly. Before we get to that though, I just wanted to go kind of quickly talk about kind of all the ways in which you investigate ways to kind of drop out of the attention economy. So you look to kind of the 60s and counterculture, and kind of withdrawing literally into kind of, created utopias. And then you talk about Melville and the short story, the Bartleby short story. Can you talk about some of the kind of examples? You use a historical kind of example, and then literature-based example, and then of course you talk about the effect of art on our attention. So you talk about your experience after a John Cage concert. I mean, all of these ways, and this is what I mean by the interdisciplinary nature of the book, that you draw on kind of all of these different disciplines to answer the same questions, or to approach the question in different ways.
Yeah. I think it's one of my favorite things to do, but also that other people do who I read, is just to give historical context to something that seems really particularly contemporary. And so I think I was interested in analogous feelings or reactions from the past that are not the same, obviously, as right now, but you could learn something from. And even something as old as like the Garden of Epicurus, that's like ancient Greece. Like if you read his reasoning for having this sort of garden on the outskirts of town, where people will learn together, but also grow like onions, and have this like little like utopian enclave. It sounds very relatable to read it now. So I was interested in kind of going back and looking at, especially for me being from California, looking at the sort of legacy of like the commune movement of the 60s and 70s, and like what they were trying to do and what problems they ran into in terms of like trying the instances where it was just trying to be an escape from politics, because I saw a sort of mirror in a similar reaction that people sometimes have to social media, which is, well, I'm just gonna like throw my phone in the ocean, right? I mean, it's a totally understandable impulse. But at the end of the day, it's like, it's actually not morally responsible or desirable to completely retreat from the world. So I think I was trying to think about, what are other models? And I think one of the most important ones for me was not only Bartleby, because, in the phrase saying, I would prefer not to, he's not saying, I won't, and he's not saying I will. He's refusing the entire terms of the question. And so that kind of like, that sidestepping was something that I got really interested in. And then the other one that was important for me was Thomas Merton, the monk / hermit, who, basically was writing in the 20th century, a lot of, he was very politically engaged, but he was doing it from the point of, in his case, like literally quite a great remove, like he's a hermit. But he has that really amazing epiphany that I quote in the book, where he sort of moved from wanting to just reject the world entirely because it was just so awful and so many terrible things were happening, to the moment where he was on a street corner when he happened to be in town in Louisville and looking around all these strangers and realizing that he loved them and he was in the world with them and had responsibility to them. So it's this kind of like, it's a very difficult balance, I think, to achieve. And it's kind of like an ongoing thing day by day. But I think I was trying to seek, something that was more nuanced and sustainable than the sort of social media is bad, I'm going to like just, the internet is bad, and just like completely cut it off and not engage with the world whatsoever. Like that doesn't seem like a desirable outcome.
Right. Yeah. And also I think something that I found interesting too is that you said, especially talking about the communes, that oftentimes what would happen is that they would just kind of end up recreating a kind of capitalist logic anyway. That is very hard.
Yeah, in some cases, yeah.
No, right. And so you kind of offer, I would love to talk about the art example, because it seems, in terms of the John Cage concert, but also, you describe an experience you had with the Ellsworth Kelly painting too, that somehow art can create like a kind of mental space for a similar maybe moment of transformation. Can you talk about the post John Cage concert and where you think, what is the relationship to art to this question of dropping out of the attention economy?
Yeah. So that John Cage performance was really interesting, in part because I was familiar with the sort of traditional symphony orchestra setup, because I was in a youth orchestra, and in my early 20s, I used to go to the symphony by myself all the time. So I was very used to that. Everyone wears all black, you shuffle in quietly. There's all these kind of cultural.
No coughing allowed.
No coughing, no laughing. Yeah. Don't clap between movements, like all of those things, right? So, and to be clear, like I enjoy it. I enjoy that. But so I was also familiar with John Cage, but I'd never seen a John Cage performance live. So I knew his whole thing about, that sound is itself already music, and, just being interested in everyday sound and noise. And so this piece was from the songbooks, and it involved a much smaller group of people wearing plain clothes. The stage looked totally different. There was a blender involved, and at some point when the blender was used, Michael Tilson Thomas used it to make a milkshake, which is in the score. Everyone just started laughing, and they'd been trying not to laugh the whole time. And then it also became clear to me that laughter is probably supposed to be part of the piece. And so there were all these things about it that were different. And then And then when I left, this is in Civic Center in San Francisco, I found that I could hear everything better. And it's not, I didn't get a hearing aid. But I don't think I ever heard sound the same way after that. I was very aware of, buses and people walking and, all of that. And so, and it's also, even in times when I am not aware of it, I know it's available to me. Like I can make the decision to, as I'm walking somewhere, kind of do a John Cage thing and become aware of all of the sounds. And so that to me is interesting in terms of the attention economy, as a reminder that you have some agency when it comes to your attention. And I think what I appreciate that artists do is that they can give you that. It's incredibly generous in my mind. I really like that kind of work rather than the sort of, the individual artist's genius, like I made this thing, here it is, versus, John Cage, or the other example I think about a lot is the James Turrell Sky Room, which is like a big room that you sit in, it's outdoors, and there's a square shaped hole in the ceiling and you can see the clouds going by. I saw this in Minneapolis. I went on 3 different days and the clouds were different on all 3 days. Obviously I know that, right? Like the same way that like I walk down the street, I've heard buses before, but there's something about the architecture of that makes it possible to see the movement, like the movement becomes palpable to you. And then after that, going forward, you probably don't, I don't really look at clouds the same way anymore. So it's this kind of like, it can teach you these framing devices where you can see things that were right in front of you that you, for reasons of habitual, thinking or looking, were not paying attention to. And I just think that those forms of attention are very different than the form of attention that a social media company or advertising company measures as attention. Like for them, they literally talk about eyeballs, right? Like that's a metric that they use, but like number of seconds spent looking at a post, that's a metric that's used, right? But there's nothing said about the quality of that attention. And I think it's generally assumed to be pretty shallow. And you want actually shallow attention for an ad, because you don't want someone to really be thinking through it. You want them to be reacting to various psychological stimuli, right? And so I got really interested in this idea of not just of practicing kind of moving your attention around, but also cultivating a form of attention that's like slower and hardier and maybe less difficult to then appropriate to something like an ad, or to just like a statement that is really incendiary that actually requires some thinking through.
Yeah, I think it reminds me, I also had an interview where you were talking about the difference between kind of creation and production, and your kind of understanding of, you see the art, maybe an artist or acts of, I think you were saying that in society, we kind of fetishize creation and or maybe more production, like creating something new, and that, your work as a kind of visual artist, certainly, with the kind of the lost objects, your work there, you were basically, not necessarily producing something out of nothing, but you were just using materials that were already existed, in the same way, that this artist was using the sky and just basically shifting our attention to that.
Yeah, as I mentioned in the book, when I was doing that artist residency at the Dump, I worked so hard on that project. I've never, other than maybe the book, like I haven't worked on anything that hard before.
Yeah.
But yeah, as you said, I didn't. The thing I was creating was an archive, and the work I was doing was research. So ultimately, the show was this archive of these 200 objects from the Dump, with these little tags that you could scan and learn the entire life story of this object, and could watch ads for it if I was able to find them, and just all the information I could find. And yeah, this woman was like really confused and asked if I did anything or if I just put things on shelves. And I was so grateful to her for that, because putting things on shelves has become like the way that I understand my work now. I'm like, oh, that's it. I just put things on shelves. And like juxtaposition can be a huge thing. Like I don't mention it in the book, but one of my favorite parts of that show was I had this totally destroyed 2002 Mac laptop. It's just totally messed up and it's like coming apart. And then I put it next to a little screen that was playing a video of Steve Jobs introducing it at Macworld and talking about how it's made out of titanium, so it's going to last forever. And it's like, Yeah, it did. It's still there. And so like that, that's where I consider that to be making something, right? It's like I'm making a comparison, but that's, and then my hope is that, again, similarly to those other pieces that I mentioned, that someone would then go home and start looking at all their objects in a new way, because most of the things from that show, I mean, it's a public disposal area, they were largely functional. And so it's like, what is trash? Everything in your apartment is already, it's someday trash, right? And then also all your objects which were born somewhere. So that's, I just really like that. As like, I hope that show was an enjoyable experience in and of itself, but ultimately I hope that then it changes the way someone looks at all of the objects that they encounter.
Yeah, and I guess just getting back to this idea of attention, and talking about kind of like deep attention and profound attention, I was really struck in the book about your discussion of the I, thou, and I, it relationship, because I think another piece of this that we haven't talked about, but we absolutely should, is you as a bird watcher. You're in the rose garden, at least virtually. I imagine you'll be going there soon. Can you describe, the importance for you in the book of an attention that is not kind of it's not appropriation, especially in terms of our relationship to nature and to crows and to birds and to animals.
Yeah.
I will say,
yeah.
just before, I've never read in the acknowledgements somebody acknowledging two birds.
A bird. Yeah. But they really, I mean, I when I wrote that, I was like, people are going to think I'm being precious, but it's really like, like I still see them. Okay, so for anyone who doesn't know, I talk about in the book befriending these couple of crows on my street, because I had just learned that crows recognize human faces, and you can sort of, they know the good humans and the bad humans, and the good cats and the bad cats, and so I endeavored to make friends with these crows that now will stop by my balcony, and that was 5 years ago. I still see the same family of crows. I've seen multiple generations at this point, but yeah, they are an example, a really important example in the book of, they're individuals, right? So I think there's a version of bird watching that I compare to like Pokemon Go, where it's like, you just see instances of something, you check it off your list. You might still aesthetically appreciate it, like just like Martin Buber in I, Thou, he says you might, aesthetically appreciate a tree, but you're not having a real encounter with something that is outside of you. And the crows have just been like the biggest lesson to me in that, where, they're also landing close enough that we're like looking at each other. And it also took a long time to win their trust to even like be able to stand that close to them. But, when you look at them, especially knowing about crows, and you see them looking at you, and there's this kind of like back and forth. I initially, and what I write about in the book, it was really sort of a lifesaver for me at the time, because it broke me out of the sort of self as avatar, or the self as pattern that just is reacting to things and in a sort of endless present. And so they would sort of break me out of that, like, oh, right, I'm an animal body, I'm in a physical place, in a time. And then when they would fly off, it would sort of remind me of the geography of my hill. So it would just kind of like break me out from that point. But I have to say that like, it's just continued over the years, where you really, when you look at them, you're really contending with like someone else, and that you might be familiar with, but you will never grasp as a sort of object. They'll always be sort of alluding, and they always do things that are like surprise me, like that I can't explain. And I also want to recommend a book that I reviewed last year by Jennifer Ackerman, called The Bird Way, which is full of pretty recent research on bird behavior. And it's just, I mean, it will blow your mind. And it will make the point I'm trying to make much better than I am. But, she talks about a species of bird that can predict hurricanes months in advance and then adjust their migratory schedules, and no one knows how they're doing it. And so there's just this kind of like, the more you learn, actually, the more mysterious it is, which I think you could apply to most of the life sciences and, geology and all of this stuff. So So that's, yeah, I think for me, it's also been really, during the pandemic, I think it was very much at the forefront for me, like how sustaining like those kinds of relationships were, and being reminded that there are these other forms of life all around me that are, on their migratory paths and kind of doing whatever they're doing that day.
And I think you've talked about kind of across many interviews, the sense of being also humbled by their presence. They're basically entirely indifferent.
Well, I mean, they are indifferent, but they also see you. And
yeah.
I think that was like the other thing that was surprising, or that I was learning from the encounter with the crows. And I talk in the book about that scrub jay that I realized was like yelling at me to go away. It's like, oh, it's not just yelling. Yeah, so it's simultaneously humbling in that it decenters you from like a human-centric point of view. And I think for me, it also has that temporal aspect, right? It reminds you that there are times other than now. But it's also, but at the same time, it makes me feel at home because animals see you. I mean, I don't know why it's so funny. Even the word like bird watching, right? It's like, I've gone bird watching with friends and they're like, oh, like, well, the birds are just people watching. Like, you see them, they're looking at you, they have to, it's like a matter of survival. So it's like, it also kind of puts you back in the world as another animal who is, interacting with these other animals and being seen, and responded to. So it's both humbling, but also it can be quite, welcoming is the wrong word. It makes, yeah, it puts you in a place and makes you feel like you have some relationship to what is physically around you.
Right, which I think you talk about, kind of moving towards, you offer some kind of, certainly some solutions or suggestions for how you kind of see, or recommendations for maybe moving forward, away from news feeds, away from notifications, certainly away from social media as we use it now. And you talk about kind of the restoration of context, which I think is in terms of bird watching, was that kind of your introduction to this idea of the restoration of context and learning about, the kind of natural environment of the place in which you find yourself?
Yeah, I would say birds were a big part of it. And also, I think it was 2017, I started learning more about bioregionalism, and I'm still I'm getting a lot better at identifying plants around here. But I have, there's always more to learn. But I'm from the Bay Area and I'm still here. So it's, I mean, to go back to something being humbling, I basically have been learning about the things that have been around me my entire life, and I just hadn't noticed or didn't distinguish. There's so many things that I thought were the same thing, and they're not even related at all. And once you notice it, you have no idea how it's the same thing with birds, right? Like if you start getting into birds, you're like, what did I just think these were all just birds? I'm not really sure what I thought. And so I talk about bird time and bird space as an example of context where you can't really separate bird watching from time or space, because birds look different during different times of the year, they go to different places, and then they also look different over a geographical range. And that's not even to mention behavior. So, and then obviously even something like the project that I did at the dump, that is also about context, like collecting all of the context around these objects. And I think ultimately what that will bring you to is you always end up somewhere where you don't have stable entities anymore. You only have relationships between things. So, like fungus with trees, or like, different animals that have co-evolved together. One that's been really interesting for me to think about in California is how our landscape here co-evolved with, thousands of years of basically indigenous land management, and the fires that we're having now are largely a result of the banning of those practices. And so it's like, I think there's a simplistic way of thinking about the fires here. It's like, oh, it's people's fault, which it is, but it's not in the way that people are thinking, is that people are actually missing from that web that existed, right? And so that's, I just feel like the more context you get about anything, the closer you get to that series of relationships, like a web of relationships that needs to be adjusted, certainly. But isn't reducible to these kind of individual entities that are just kind of like going around each other in some sort of Newtonian physics way. And so that's something that I've continued to be interested in, and something that I've been thinking about that since How to Do Nothing, like a sort of continuation of the context collapse idea, which is just that idea that Dana Boyd, the media scholar, has written about quite a bit, that when you make statements online, they have very little context. So if you think about Twitter, you're seeing statements by people you don't know in an order that they didn't happen and divorced from the time in which they were said. And I have been thinking a lot lately about embodied and embedded knowledge as the sort of opposite of that. And my example would be like going for a walk with someone who's lived in a town for 50 years. This just happened to me recently, who's pointing out things to you in the town through their lens, and they're introducing you to people. And also like your being there is a sort of like, that was a socially agreed upon thing. Like they're allowing you to know those things, right? And that's just such a different kind of knowledge and passing on of knowledge than this like complete opposite, which is like, I don't have a relationship to the person who's saying this. There is no reason for me to be reading this statement from this person at this time in this place. It's like, I can't think of two things that are more opposite than that.
Yeah, I think this gets to, I mean, it highlights the kind of urgency, I think, of the book. I mean, there's so many reasons why I think it's resonated with so many people, and certainly, you know, just you cite William James, and I wanted to read who speaks about kind of attention at the turn of the century, or his understanding at the turn of the century. But it's I think it's prescient, and also it kind of highlights the point that you're making, which is that as soon as you put your attention on something, it then shapes basically the entire way you see the world and how you live. You know, so you were saying that you learned more about birds and kind of bird song, and then all of a sudden you were hearing many more birds, or you're now noticing many more plants. And so William James, I'll just read this quote because I think it's really brilliant. He writes in 1890, so quite a long time ago. He writes, millions of items of the outward order are present to my senses which never properly enter into my experience. Why? Because they have no interest for me. My experience is what I agree to attend to. Only those items which I notice shape my mind. Without selective interest, experience is an utter chaos. Interest alone gives accents and emphasis, light and shade, background and foreground, intelligible perspective, in a word. It varies in every creature, but without it, the consciousness of every creature would be a grey, chaotic indiscriminateness, impossible for us to even conceive.
Yeah, I love that.
I love the grey, chaotic indiscriminateness. That's like a new feed.
Yeah, right. I know, totally. It's like that. Yeah, right. And it's just, yeah. And I think I mentioned that in the context of that study that was done where they flash these images at someone, or that they're basically, I won't describe the whole study, but it basically showed that like people would only register something, this thing that flashed really quickly, if it was like their name, or something sort of recognizable to them. And it reminds me that I also cite the article by Jenny Odell about bias, implicit bias. Yeah. She has a book coming out in September, I think, that I'm reading right now, called The End of Bias. And I highly, highly, highly recommend it. It's it's amazing. I'm not done with it yet, but it's so good. And it's you can see why I would be blurbing this book, is because it's about attention, right? It's about trying to move from a place of habitual, deeply, deeply habitual thought patterns to just like slowing them down enough that you can see them. And then over time, like learning enough to be able to kind of like shift them. And it's really hard. And she's very also quite honest about her own process of learning and going through that. But it's really interesting to think about her argument in conjunction with that quote, which is like, you you can see how something like implicit bias would be related, where it's like you can make the decision to try to pay attention to what you haven't been paying attention to, or people you haven't been paying attention to. And so I think it really is, I mean, if you read her book, it's like you realize that attention, like this type of attention, is like really, really important. I mean, for so many reasons, but in this case of just like how people even see each other at all.
And it is in fact a sustained effort, because there's another, you also cite James earlier, and you kind of use his argument, and I think it's right, you know, that attention is a series, it's a series of attentions. It's not as if, oh, now I have attention on my discussion with Jenny and there wasn't light shining on my face, you know, half an hour ago, or, you know, that there's a smell in the, you know, that all of us are constantly throughout the course of this discussion re-engaging with the screen, or, you know, that it's kind of like a string theory. Can you describe his understanding of attention? Because it's maybe counterintuitive, but once you understand it, it makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, he's basically arguing there that there's no such thing as sustained attention, that you have to bring your attention back over and over again, and to do so means to find something novel about it. So things that have that are changing and have a lot of novelty, I don't think are that hard to pay attention to for that reason, right? But if you perceive something as being unchanging or indistinguishable, then it's on you to sort of like find those angles or ask those questions. There's a book by Rob Walker called The Art of Noticing that I really enjoy. And it kind of plays that out, where he gives you a series of exercises for noticing things. And one of them is to just pick something to pay attention to all day. And his example is security cameras, which I also really recommend. So interesting. So I did that one. I spent one whole day everywhere. This is before the pandemic. So I was kind of out and about, and first of all, so many security cameras, so many different kinds of security cameras, and then where they're placed will make you notice the architecture of buildings. But it's that, right? It's like he gives you this question that allows you to then like come back to something over and over again, which without that question might be a lot harder. So, or it might be sort of more vague. That said, it sounds, in that quote, he makes it sound very like effortful. And I think one thing that I've been interested in is finding things or situations where it's easy to do that, and seeking those out. So for me, that's bird watching, because even when you're looking at one bird, its behavior is so unpredictable and it could fly away at any time that it's not hard to just keep paying attention to that, right? It's actually hard for me to do the opposite, which is like do whatever I need to be doing. But you know, there's I've been really interested in the last year in reading Jane McGonigal on video games. You would think that I would be very anti-video games, but I'm not. I'm a really big fan of Zelda. I've been playing a lot of Zelda lately, but you know, she talks about a similar kind of like a flow state, basically, right? So I think, although she's also very, very careful to define like what is video game addiction, like at what point, you know, it's not helpful to you anymore. But yeah, I think I felt a little bit like you can't expect to have someone walk away from a very, very carefully engineered attention economy where all their friends are, and not give them something else that's absorbing, you know what I mean? But absorbing for maybe more sustainable and meaningful reasons. So like like I said, finding situations where that kind of like being able to be continuously curious and finding out new things, wherever that, I think that's very different for every person, but for me it happens to be outside, but I don't think that's true for everyone.
Yeah, lovely. Well, I will say I'm just looking at the time, and since we started a bit late, I think we'll end, if that's all right with you, Jenny. So Jenny hasn't had breakfast, and and she will have to leave imminently, but first we'll just do a few Q&As. So if you haven't posted your question or comment in the chat, please do go ahead and post it, because I will now be asking your questions and posing them to Jenny. I'm just posting the link to a place where you can buy this fabulous book. I really, really urge you to go out and order it, because this is what it looks like again. This is the library copy, but you can see I've I used up a whole pad of post-it notes with all the references, not only the references of Jenny's own really funny and sharp writing. I mean, one of my favorite quotes, Jenny, is that you described phones as a heavy black rectangle of potentiality and dread. Every time I look at my phone, I'm thinking, it's just a rectangle of potentiality and dread. Not only should you go and buy this fantastic book, but I really recommend that you read it outside, because as Jenny's kind of been saying, you emerge from the book, and I truly mean this. The last week I've had this experience. I just feel much more attentive to birdsong and nature. I mean, not only is spring very much here in Paris, but it's almost like having somebody kind of wash your face, and you start seeing the world in a new way. So it's I really, really could not recommend it more highly, and it just also opens up all of these different worlds to you. So whether you're interested in philosophy or history or literature, or visual art, all kind of data and technology, and there's really something for everyone. So please go ahead and buy it, and I will now be reading some questions that I have received. So okay, so Kurt would like to know, he kind of makes a comment, and then it leads into a question. He writes, the American obsession with consumption and comparison seems so antagonistic to becoming an individual and choosing something different. How do individuals find support, find community, find models of living, like you have touched on? A small question to start.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing that I have found very heartening to think about in the last year that's related to this is like building sort of small networks of people. One, if I haven't been able to meet in the last year, but some friends of mine, I think about 5 years ago, started this salon called Living Room Light Exchange, and it's all new media artists and writers, and we would meet in a different person's living room every month, and it was partially an acknowledgement of the fact that there's very little space for artists in the Bay Area, so we have to be smushed in these living rooms. But it was also very convivial because you're in someone's home, and 3 people would present their work each time, but it was always work in progress, and it was always a very robust discussion. And so many of my friends are from that sort of network, and you really sort of keep tabs on each other's work. And we were all motivated by a common critique of Silicon Valley and techno optimism, and that it's really just to have that's like a group, but I think even having 4 or 5 people that you can sort of discuss things with, whether you formalize that into something like this salon, or it's just even a group chat. I remain inspired by the fact that that's something that you can build, and as we learned from the pandemic, you don't have to be in the same place. I think it helps if you are, but I think you can, it's something that I actually tell my students a lot, in the art department, because they're often about to graduate, is I tell them, right now you have classes, so you have you have an excuse to talk to other people who are interested in the same thing. When you go on, don't forget that you can just kind of do that for yourself, right? You can, not that it's always easy, but you can, try to reach out and form, again, I would emphasize the size, a small network where everyone is known and recognized and challenged and welcomed. And to me, that is such a huge antidote to the sort of anonymity of social media. And it's something that it's helped me kind of shift, because I think we all have a need for something like civic life, or something that's maybe a little bit different from just close friends or friendship or family. So I've been really trying to seek out that something that fulfills that, because I don't find it on social media. And I think we do have the opportunity to use at least the tools that we have, again, even a group chat, to form something like that.
Yes, lovely. Thank you. There's a question from Ulrika. I hope I'm saying that correctly. She or they ask you, how would you explain why people hang on to objects?
That's actually something that I learned a lot about after I was at the dump. I did a sequel to that project. So it was called The Bureau of Suspended Objects. I'm the Bureau. So the Bureau.
just in case you're wondering.
Yeah. Which is a really funny joke until you have to do all of the work of a bureau by yourself, which I did. I had like stamps and, the book that I produced is like 270 pages of objects. Anyway, so I was the bureau at the Palo Alto Art Center, and I didn't have access to the dump anymore. So I was having people bring me pre-trash, which I defined as something that you look at in your home that you've already gotten rid of in your head, but it's just there. And so it's a matter of time. It's already trash when you look at it. And so I would ask these people to bring those in and fill out this carbon copy form that I modeled after various US tax forms because I wanted it to be really bureaucratic. And one of the questions on it was obviously, why did you get this? But why are you getting rid of it? And then what's your guilt level 1 to 10? And like all these other kind of questions. And to me, it seemed like from doing that project, I will say the number one thing was that we shouldn't be buying each other gifts, because that's the majority of things that people want to get rid of are gifts. And we would all just be doing everyone a favor if we just didn't get gifts anymore, or thought of a different kind of what a gift means. But the other thing was that people associate, so they don't get rid of those gifts because they associate them with the person. And then they feel bad about it, right? So I think it's just, it's associations with things, parts of your life. Some people wouldn't get rid of things because they associated it with their youth. And if they get rid of it, then they're accepting that they've moved on to a different stage in their life. Or things from, past relationships, like breakups, where they have an ambivalent relationship with the thing that the object symbolizes, that they haven't worked out. And that gets expressed through hanging onto the object. So, I'm just like, even looking like the things that I have that are, that I've hung on to, they have a sort of like talismanic quality, right? They stand for something. And it's like, if you have it, either that means you want it in your life, you want that thing in your life, or you don't know what your relationship is to that thing.
Lovely. I guess there have been less questions. Fewer questions, but a lot of people describe their relationships with their birds, their local birds. So Jim says, I live in Savoy, across the street from our apartment. High in the trees are 7 crow's nests. It is a wonderful experience. They are my neighbors.
Oh.
And Margot has a different conception of crows. She writes, the crows in Paris daunt me. They carry a preternatural energy that feels so dominant over us humans. I feel like they are talking behind my back and plotting their takeover when I encounter them on the Champ de Mars. Like it's just a matter of time till they're in charge.
To that point, at the end of, it's kind of spoiler alert, but at the end of the Jennifer Ackerman book about bird behavior, she talks to this corvid specialist. So that's like crows, ravens, scrub jays. And he half jokingly speculates that if humans were to, like decline and disappear, that it would kind of make sense for crows to take over, because they would, and for the reason that they have come to depend so much on us and our environments, that if we were gone, the challenge of having to figure that out would make their brains get bigger or like more developed. And then we would have this like crow society, which I'm like, I don't know, it sounds pretty great. But yeah, they can be very menacing. And there was an article recently about a friend of mine in Oakland whose dog somehow earned the disfavor of the local crows. And it became this huge problem where the crows were constantly, every time they brought the dog out. And so they had to hire this woman who's basically like a crow whisperer to adjust the relationship. And she was successful. She was able to do it. She made peace between the crows, but they have their whole, I always wonder what's going on with them every day. Like I at this point I've learned the different sounds that they make, and one of them is specifically like, it's like the cat that we don't like sound. And it sounds like a word to me now because I know what it means. And so I'll be inside and I'll hear it and I go outside, okay, there's the cat, you know, it's walking down the street that they don't like for some reason. So it's like, yeah, they definitely have the politics and like social, you know, dynamic in their group, and that's just going on all the time.
Jenny, what are you working on now? What's your second book about?
So it's about time, and it has another very misleading title. So How to Do Nothing was not actually about how to do nothing. This book is called Saving Time. It will not save you time. I will tell you that now. And it's not a time management book, although I do have a chapter where I sort of critique commercial time management. But it's sort of equal parts trying to look more into the history of how we came to see time as money, but also this, again, one of these sort of ongoing questions that I live with, which is how do you live in what feels like the meantime of climate change? Of course, it's not the meantime because it's already started happening, but like, you know, how do you think about time and like live in that space? And ultimately, the title Saving Time is referring to like rescuing a form of time or a way of seeing time that's not determinist. So knowing that like every moment is original, because I feel like there's a real risk with especially people, you know, my generation and younger maybe, where it's like, if you see if you extrapolate from now and you see the future as kind of like plodding forward in this very predictable way, there's a real risk that you won't do anything. So like that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to, and get depressed. I mean, like there's personal like, you know, effects of that too. But so that's kind of what I'm writing about. And if How to Do Nothing had a lot of birds, this one's gonna have a lot of rocks. This one's gonna be the rock book. So I have a whole, I was joking to my friend where I'm on chapter 4 right now. I was like, I think chapter 4 is just gonna be about sand. It's just sand, this is sand chapter. I mean, the whole book could really be about sand, but I'm gonna try to keep that from happening.
There's at least one person who actually helped me do the art for the event in the audience who's going to be very happy to hear it's a book about rocks.
Yeah.
Nice. My last question, Jenny, is and thank you so much for your extra time. What are you reading right now? I imagine you're reading lots of different things, and you've mentioned some of the things that you've enjoyed, but and you mentioned the book about bias. Is there anything else that you're reading and thinking about?
Yeah. So the bias book is the one I'm like sort of in it right now. I recently finished a book called Sand Talk, and the subtitle is How Indigenous Thinking Can Save the World. That book is kind of, braiding sweetgrass was really, really important for How to Do Nothing, and Sand Talk is kind of like that book for this one for me, because it's not just about, you know, obviously it's about Aboriginal culture, but it's also the way it's written and the way he talks about what writing means and what it means to tell a story. It's been inspiring for me in terms of like method, not just content. And that's kind of where that idea about embedded knowledge was, I think I was trying to have that thought for a long time. And then I read that book and I kind of finally understood what I was trying to get at, because something like songlines, for example, in Australia is a really good example of embedded knowledge, embedded in a place, like in a sort of spatial, like geographical place. So, and then afterwards I'll be reading I think it's called A Vast Winter Count, which is about California before colonization. So yeah.
Lovely.
And I read a little bit of it so far before I have to read the end of Bias in order to write the blurb on time. So that's the one that I'm on right now. But yeah, like I said, highly recommend.